Richard Mosse, Broken Spectres. So before we begin, I must say some thank yous, and the biggest one to Richard Mosse himself. It's been such a pleasure working with you. We really appreciate your generosity of spirit, your ability to always be available in a very, very busy year of your life, and just thank you for saying yes. We are so honored to have this exhibition here. While I have the opportunity in front of a microphone, I'd also like to say thank you to a few other people. First of all, Devin Owens from Jack Shainman Gallery, who's a great collaborator throughout the course of this show. Everyone from the Thoma Foundation, but I'd like to name check some of the people that are here with us today. Megan Robeson, Rachel Lewis, Madison Spencer, and of course, Kathleen Richards, who's here in Santa Fe consistently. And of course, none of us would be here today if it weren't for the vision and the inspiration of Carl and Marilyn Thoma. So thank you. I'd like to just say a few quick words about the foundation and some of our activities and a little bit about this exhibition before we turn it over to Richard. As many of you know, if you're here, the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Foundation has an incredible collection of works across genres, but there's a major chapter which is dedicated to media arts, and that's digital art, film, video, sound. And we share that work with the public in three different ways. First, we have something called the Museum Loan Program. So our artworks are loaned out to museums, either individually or touring shows and curated shows. We also have our headquarters in Dallas. And while that's our offices, it is possible to take tours of our offices, and there's about 80 works at any given time up in our offices in Dallas. And then this is our consistent space, our public-facing space here in Santa Fe, which we're really delighted to have. And if any of you have been here before, you know that by and large, the exhibitions here are group shows. They're sort of collection-based shows, group shows, where we kind of call it a salon-style hang for the digital age, primarily for our media arts collection. But when Carl and Marilyn collected Broken Spectre, which is the work that you will see after our presentation today, in 2023, it really became a cornerstone and a majorly important work in the collection, and something that we really wanted to share with our audiences here in Santa Fe. Yet, as for those of you that have been here, if you have a show, an artwork that has an incredible sound score, as this does, the sound score composed by Ben Frost, it's very difficult to show something in this space in a group show with lots of other works. It's just sound bleed. So Carl and I had a conversation and tried to think up an alternate idea, and we came up with the idea of a solo show, because that way we could borrow photographs by Richard, and we could show our impeccable work here, our tour de force by Richard Mosse, and there wouldn't be a problem with sound bleed. In fact, the sound from this work, when you're going throughout the exhibition and looking at all the photographs, and there's another video work upstairs, this soundtrack actually becomes the soundtrack for your experience going through the entire exhibition. So we brought this idea to Richard, who immediately said, excellent, I'd be honored. And we said, no, we would be honored. And we did that back and forth for a little while. And then we quickly got off the Zoom with him before he would change his mind. And we started to have a conversation with Devin from Jack Shainman Gallery, who really helped us a lot with many other works. There's 20 photographs in the exhibition to complement and give context to the work that we have here, Broken Spectre. So a bit of bio for Richard. First and foremost, I can just say that Richard is one of the most important contemporary artists of our time. And in my opinion, that's because he has this unique ability to create work that is as spectacular as it is meaningful. So you'll see with all of the work in the show, it's gripping, it brings you in, the images are completely stunning and beautiful, and yet you are really digesting and confronting some of the more difficult issues of our day, of our times. And this has kind of been throughout his career and work, and we'll look at some of his other projects today as well. Richard has won many awards, he's in many collections, to name just a few, and had both in collections and exhibitions, SF MoMA, the National Gallery in DC, the National Gallery in Australia, the Phi Center in Montreal. He's won the Guggenheim Fellowship, he's just finishing up the Rome Prize, and all of the lauded awards for photography in Europe and in the US. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Richard, just to kind of give you all a sense of the run of show. Richard's going to do a bit of a show and tell presentation of a few works that are not in this exhibition that kind of give you more of a sense of the progression of his work and his practice and some of the threads that run throughout. Then we're going to turn it over to Broken Spectre, and after he gives a presentation of Broken Spectre, we'll have time for questions from the audience. One quick note is that we are opening up to the public at 5 p.m., so we do have a hard stop, and you're going to see a little behind the scenes of chairs coming in and out of this space and people coming in, but that's part of the fun of it. So, Richard, thank you. Thanks,
Kathleen, and thanks to you all for coming out to the show and to the opening. And it's a very exciting time in Santa Fe with Site International. So it's a great honor to be a part of this, and great honor to be given this solo show in Art Vault, which is a unique space. You can see it's it's a fascinating piece of architecture. And I think, as you said, Kathleen, to have a group show with a loud piece like this, a loud, obnoxious piece like this, it's overwhelming. It's not fair for the other artists. And so I'm so thrilled to get the solo so that all that sound permeates the entire exhibition and the whole building. And there's, on the other side of the building, if you have the energy after watching this, there's another piece which is heavy duty. And the work is all about the Amazon rainforest deforestation, particularly in Brazil. But I'll talk about that in a bit. I just want to say some massive thank yous. This is a huge show. Like, I don't know, to me it looks pretty perfect, but there's a lot of work that went into it. And that's exciting. I've never seen such a good hang of this work, or of any of my work, actually. And I can't imagine that was easy on your end.
It was fun.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm such a pedantic, technically annoying, boring.
Untrue, untrue.
I just say, I'd like it a different shade of grey, and I'm glad we've worked through the space together, because I do hope that, resolving this room for large-scale video, you can carry that forward for other video artists in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, you're a little bit of a guinea pig, and we're seeing so far it worked.
Well, hopefully, and and it's still some fine-tuning to do, but it's pretty damn good. So, without further ado, because I'm an awful, I talk the hind legs off a donkey. I better move fast.
I'll keep a check on time.
Okay, great. So, do you want me to launch into the?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, yeah, Kathleen chose the chapters, and they're very good introduction. So when I was a young lad, only 21, I'd finished my undergrad in English Lit in London, and I moved to Berlin to work as a dishwasher in an Irish pub. And after several months of that, I realized that my dreams were bigger than that. And I bought I saved up my shillings, my Deutschmarks, a long time ago now, and I bought a little Volkswagen Golf, a very old one, and a Nikon camera. And I said, I'll go off and be a photojournalist, because that's what I wanted to do. And I went off down to the post-war Balkans, which at that time were still like very fresh, traumatic landscapes in terms of, well, the wars that had just ended, especially in places like Kosovo and Serbia. A bit more recently at that point in Bosnia and Croatia. And I wanted to document something. I decided, I don't really know why, but I wanted to document the subject that I felt was the most important, which is the missing persons crisis. So you have hundreds of thousands of people who never came home, and we don't know what happened to them. And I think for a nation, for a community, for a society to lack that closure of knowing what happened to their loved ones, it's an open wound that can't heal. And so this is an abstraction that I tried to document with my Nikon camera, and I couldn't, because it wasn't there. And this was the biggest lesson for me. And I'm going really far back in my repertoire, my archive here, specifically to explain like an important lesson that I learned then as a storyteller, which was that, quite simply, the world is more complex than caricature images and illustrations for some writer in a Sunday magazine. It's particularly conflict and politics and geopolitics and war. It's very hard to describe with words, let alone images. And often it's intangible. So it's beyond the concrete technology of the photographic medium, the simple, dumb optic of the lens cannot describe something that isn't physically in front of it. So I was very frustrated. I drove back to Berlin, and in a fit, I began reading, and I began looking around. I was reading Andreas Huyssen and Judith Butler, and I was looking at Thomas Struth, a little young lad, and I just thought, you know what, photojournalism's not equipped to articulate these issues that I'm experiencing. So I traded in that camera, the Nikon, for a 4x5 view camera, an old Linhof German, like the old camera with the cape. And I began documenting the landscape, the topography, the traces of the conflict on the landscape. And I began to observe how ethnic cleansing was expressed on the architecture, on the archaeology. So this is interesting. So the Kosovo Albanians are fighting for their freedom against the Serbs in Kosovo at that time. And so they started literally dismantling Serb Orthodox church architecture. And Kosovo happens to be the sort of cradle of Serb Orthodox monasteries and ancient church architecture. So yeah, what they were doing was in a way disavowing Serbian history on some level. They were trying to remove it, to delete it. And I wasn't interested in taking a side. But this particular church, for example, it was an early success for me because on one hand, you can look from the outside in, from the Serb perspective, but also from the Kosovo Albanian perspective, looking from the outside, from the inside out. So I started to think more carefully about landscape and architecture. And moving swiftly on, I went all the way around the houses, desperate to try to be a photographer. No one would take me, no art school. And I finally got onto Goldsmiths and they kicked me out. And I thought, I'm really not destined. So I moved to Ireland and started taking commercial photos for small companies, which was, luckily by the grace of God, Todd Papageorge at Yale let me into the program, the MFA. And I started at Yale in 2006. And I went down to the Mexican border, which I dropped these slides into the show because it's quite near here. It's close to probably your hearts and certainly on our minds, particularly these days. And this was back in 2006, 7, 8, where there was it was topical at that time. And this is another lesson that I'm trying to introduce you to, at least that was important to me. And that is that I went down to the border to try to photograph the illegal immigrants, as they're known, or refugees or migrant workers crossing the border. Now, that's hard to do because they're not stupid. They cross at night, generally speaking. And you can't really photograph very easily at night. So I was stumped. I didn't know what to do. So I started looking for the traces. And they're everywhere, actually, once you really look. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit sketchy on some of these borders, but they're all over the place, actually. Like this bag, which has an entire story of a woman's life with her children. She's going to learn English in Fresno, California. There's a little card explaining there's an English language training and a Spanish language Bible, Book of Psalms, mosquito repellent, all these things that you would need in the Sonoran Desert. And she probably was chased by a border patrol and had to drop the bag. And that's when I opened the bag. And so this led to a series of pictures of just these little traces that people would leave bottles, which is probably something you've heard about. And that was an interesting thing to photograph, just in terms of the landscape. Little still lives, actually. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, I hit a wall. I'm like, I actually don't know if these things, this detritus in front of me, has any relation to a family or anyone crossing the border at all. Because I was using my imagination, and I came across this right by the Rio Grande River in Laredo, Texas. And it's a page torn out of a children's book. And it says, they continued down the yellow brick road that led them to the edge of a river. The Tin Woodman said, I will cut down some trees and make a raft. The Scarecrow volunteered to push the raft across the river with a pole. Now, you can't make that up. Here's a river where families are literally building rafts to cross to reach a better life. And right beside it, we have Dora the Explorer on the shoe there. We have some Americana doll with the stars and stripes. We have a Gonzo toy. It was all too good. So I did a little gardening. I arranged things, and I took a picture. And I had absolutely no idea if these things were from illegal migrants or refugees or whatever we want to call them, or if they were just rubbish. And I think that was liberating for me as an artist because I could step away from the literal into well, into a world of parafiction or into my imagination. I could let go of the relation to veracity, to the claim for truth with a capital T, and to try to reach a different kind of truth with a small t, one that's based on human experience and is more poetic, more fictive. So that's my second lesson that I'm trying to explain to you. And then my third little hurdle in life was after Yale, I got the Leonore Annenberg Fellowship, which was terrific. And one of the things I did with it, I went to Iraq in 2009 and photographed Saddam Hussein's palaces. And I thought this work was really quite interesting, because there was this sort of juxtaposition and counterpoint of US military sort of corporate office partitions and air conditioners and all the things that the infrastructure they have based on these occupied palaces of Saddam Hussein. Which are very pompous and gaudy and badly built and tend to be very sort of strange architecture. And so I thought that was really quite an interesting project. And this is the river Tigris in central Iraq. And this is the bombed palace of Uday Hussein, the evil son of Saddam. And yeah, these troops they brought me there because I begged them. And then they were just lolling around a pool. And it's almost got the sort of classical history painting element to it. And of course, I blew it up really big. And I observed, the anthropology of life, the soldiers living amongst the palace architecture and pumping iron with a cigar. This is quite a normal thing. Smoking was a big part of life in the army. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because I sort of hit a wall, because people weren't interested. I felt like photography wasn't quite getting there, like even with an interesting subject like that. And so I moved quite quickly from there. I wanted to smash it open. Can I go on to the next
Keep going, yeah,
chapter?
Absolutely.
And so I said, well, okay, I'd like to explore the basic elements of documentary photography and to overturn them, and to do so in a way that's more reflexive about the technologies, Western surveillance and reconnaissance technologies, to use some of those military technologies that are also used in rare earth mining, which is a big part of the conflict in Eastern Congo. So I wanted to really think more deeply about the medium, to try to foreground not just rare earth mining in the imagery and Western military gaze, but also my own hand, the constructed nature of the documentary image, and to really do it in this really aggressively aesthetic way. And so I went to Eastern Congo, which at that time, and still sadly today, is in a very, very poor situation with at least 100 different armed groups fighting, which are like ragtag bands with heavy weapons who fight each other constantly and displace civilians. And of course, it's always the civilians who suffer. And now the Rwandans have moved in with their proxy armies. I worked there for 5 years. I started this on a whim, just a kind of meditation on photography for myself. It was a very personal thing. And when I got back, I started to really believe in the project, and I applied to the Guggenheim and I got it. And so I was off to the races then. And then I started really digging deep into, over a course of 5 years, you build relationships, you start to learn a bit more about the conflict. And you become more located, actually. And so, yeah, I was also completely free. I wasn't embedded with the UN. I wasn't working with the Congolese army. It was just me. And I wasn't even, a photojournalist who had to answer to an editor. So I had this freedom as an artist to travel into, over front lines, into different armed groups, and to start to gather this unusual footage, very incongruous type of material, photographs of Eastern Congo taken with this type of film called Kodak Aerochrome, which sees infrared light. And it was designed in World War II to detect camouflage over the battlefield in airplanes. And it did that by seeing an invisible type of light, which has no color, infrared, but portraying it, registering it in these wild pinks. And so I was able to sort of speak indexically, as well as metaphorically, as well as aesthetically. So I had these three gears going at the same time. And for me, that was really, it was a crazy time in my life. I produced a lot. And These are the M23 who now run Goma and Bukavu. It's very sad for me. My friends are actually refugees in Bujumbura, and it's not good. And nobody cares anymore because the world is changing so quickly. Used to be, we had US aid and stuff. And it was a topographic study as well, because you can really understand a lot about the conflict through looking carefully at the landscape. This is right on the border with Rwanda. So that's a porous border. A lot of armed groups, FDLR, M23, all of these guys would have come across here, these borders. But also you could see it in land use. So it's interesting, the Congolese tribes or communities would traditionally farm as agronomists, as you know, they would plant crops. Whereas the Nilotic tribes of Rwanda would traditionally always have herded cattle nomadically. And so you can start to see how the land is carved up. This was, you know, primary rainforest until not that long ago, but you really get to see a lot by looking carefully at the land and understand it's a land conflict at the end of the day. And all the minerals in our Apple computers and our iPhones and now in our electric vehicles require these rare earths, such as coltan, cassiterite, cobalt, but also they have diamonds, they have uranium, they have you name it. It's the richest, poorest country in the world. And so there's so much to think about. And so to image it with a film tech, so every square inch of this landscape of Eastern Congo would have been mapped by multinational mining companies with this type of film back in the 80s and 90s to look for rare earths. And so it's very much a sort of appropriate medium, I felt. And then I applied with the work to the Venice Department of Arts in Ireland, because I'm Irish, and they have a pavilion in the Venice Biennale. And they decided to give it to me, to award it to me that year, which was a huge honor, 2013. And I worked with Trevor Tweeton and Ben Frost, who are the same guys I worked with on this film and have worked with since, to make a film called The Enclave, which was a 6-screen, double-sided screen film installation. So it was shot on Super 16mm film. And it's this infrared film. And it's about, I think it was 39 minutes. And it was a kind of, because the Irish nation state decided in their wisdom to refuse a pavilion in the Giardini of the Venice Biennale. So we are at one of these collateral satellite spaces. And so it was very hard for people to find, but for some reason, it became one of the talked about pavilions, which was terrific. The word of mouth is the best of all. And so that led to like a point in my practice where I really wanted to get away from this aggressive color and to find, you know, I was growing as well. This is 5 years later. And I wanted to look at the world in a different way. And at this time, in around 2014, the European refugee crisis was exponential. Tidal wave of human souls. There were about 1 million people landing by sea per year on the shores of Europe. Of course, that doesn't include the ones landing overland. And a lot of them died. Also, they died on the way across the Sahara Desert. I began to examine these journeys with a very specific military technology, which I found fascinating. And I learned about it. It's not designed for storytellers like me. It's not designed for filmmakers. It's designed for militaries, police forces, armies, border enforcement, Frontex. And it's designed to detect heat from a distance of 30 kilometers day or night, which is 18 miles away, day or night. That's human body heat. So obviously it can detect the heat of the moon far, far further away. But human body heat, you can actually detect and track and target insurgents from that vast a distance. So it was used as part of weapon systems, and it was also used in long-range border enforcement, of course, which is where I became interested in using it to represent this subject. It was also used in search and rescue. And I managed to get my hands on it. It wasn't easy. And I made these, what I call heat maps, where I mapped migrant staging sites, refugee camps, with a thermal camera. This is one in Macedonia, on the border with Macedonia and Greece, called Idomeni. And This is one in Athens called Elliniko, and it was in the old former Olympic Stadium, which is a marvelous symbol of the world we've created, right? So we build these ridiculous, stadiums that are then abandoned and then are filled with the marginal people we don't want to welcome into our societies, that we keep out. And the field is very squalid and muddy, terrible conditions. And then I began working on a film using the camera, just like the Enclave. I made a film called Incoming, and these are some images from it. So it's seeing body heat, and which is a fascinating metaphor, I felt, to think about the subject of the refugees' journey, because quite literally their precarity is predicated on their survival in terms of living in and out in the elements, in tents, and crossing the cold sea waves, as these people just have. Some people drown on these journeys, and we witnessed some of that. And then the exposure in summer. So body heat is an important way of thinking. At least for me, it was a sort of it activated. It sort of allowed me to become the thing that I feared most, which is a photojournalist, actually, but in this inflected way that was speaking reflexively about my own society's failure as a European to grant these people asylum, which is enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, which all of us have ratified, all of our nations. And so that became a 52-minute film, showed at the Barbican in 2017. And these are the thermal handprints on the rubber dinghy. People coming off, they are just touch it briefly, but the thermal heat resides on the materiality of the dinghy itself, the rubber. And this is on a USS Theodore Roosevelt, which is an aircraft carrier forward deployed at this time in the Persian Gulf off the coast of Iran and Iraq. And they were doing bombing runs on Islamic State 24 hours a day with F-18s. And it was just an extraordinary spectacle of aircraft taking off and landing, which represented through a weapons-grade thermal camera was totally remarkable. And so that led me to Broken Spectre. And so I was actually really burned out when I finished all that work. I was seen too many terrible things, honestly. And I decided I'd take a little moment for myself and to do something I always wanted to do. And I'm very interested in optics and light. And it's very hard to photograph ultraviolet light, reflective ultraviolet light, because it doesn't transmit through glass. And lenses are made of glass. So you have to get special lenses made of, I think it's, oh God, I can't remember suddenly, quartz fluorite and stuff like this. And so I went down to Ecuador, and I wanted to photograph just the species on the rainforest floor in the cloud forest, to show the teeming biodiversity. And I've always sort of been interested to take a closer look at the non-human world on a macro level, just because it's so interdependent and there's so much predation, and you have like plants that have evolved to be carnivorous, and you have insects that have evolved to be katydids, to look like leaves. So it's extraordinary, the amount of evolution. And so I spent some time working down there, and it was a success. I relaxed and enjoyed myself, and I made these strange images. And then sadly, in my opinion, Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018 in Brazil. At this point, I had my little rest, and I felt sort of psychologically and emotionally bonded with the forest on some level, even if it was only just starting out. And yeah, in January 1st, 2019, he took office, and he called himself Captain Chainsaw. He really encouraged deforestation. So the environmental criminals were given free rein and the carte blanche. And yeah, so it was of this exponential rise that summer in 2019. You might even remember it in the newspapers. It was just a huge scale of burning, the likes of which we'd never seen, because there was also a very long dry season due to climate change. And so that together with the national politics of Bolsonaro and the encouragement, so they have very strict laws in Brazil, and he just sort of stopped enforcing them and told people to go ahead and burn and do this wildcat mining for gold, which is super destructive on the river systems. So I started to try to represent that, and I used this very specific black and white infrared film, which scientists use, that is used for detecting and understanding the vegetation index, which is in the near infrared, but it's also super heat sensitive. So the film itself was, to take it to the humid rainforest is a fool's errand, but then to go and photograph forest fires with it is really looking for failure. And I did that deliberately on some level because I wanted, for a start, also, it was also the end of the medium. It was the last sheets of this film, which was discontinued in 1998. And I wanted to express the sort of impossibility of describing what I was seeing, which was one of the most depressing things I've really looked at, actually, and I've seen a fair share. When the forest, for as far as the eye can see, is just charred. It's tough to see, and no one understands that. And it's so important that you find a way to, as a storyteller, to communicate that. And documentary photography is just so good at that. It's the only medium that can say, look, I've seen this thing and I want you to see it. Here's evidence. You can't do that with a painting in the same way, obviously. So, I mean, not that you shouldn't make paintings of this, but photography has this way of revealing evidential. There was a photon that came from the sun that bounced off this landscape that affected the silver halide on the film. So it's incontrovertible on some level. It has this special relationship to truth. And at the same time, I felt I couldn't describe what I was looking at. It was so big. Climate change is too big to describe. We don't have a lens wide enough, literally. And the rainforest itself is a kind of hyper-object that spans 9 countries. How could I possibly take an adequate picture of the forest, let alone its cataclysmic destruction on a kind of international level? And there's layers of the environmental degradation, of the devastation of the forest. It's happening, on a local level, of course, culturally, but also on a national level with Bolsonaro, but then also on an international level with these multinational companies, many of whom are American. And I just struggle to describe these invisible forces. And you've seen one picture of a burnt forest, you've seen them all. And you need to resuscitate that imagery somehow. And my answer initially was to create images that point to the failure of photography, to the end of the world, in a way. But this was nihilistic, I felt. And I also passed by this billboard, and I found this fascinating, because here was a drone being advertised to farmers in the middle of the Amazon rainforest on the soybean highway. And it's about photography. And I don't know, it's probably not possible to see, but there are like stacks of gold coins emerging from between the rows of soybean crops there in this advertisement. And it says in Portuguese, I think it says, our technology will make your profits sprout. And it's advertising certain types of photographic imaging. I'm like, damn. So, because all my practice, I've been interested in these aggravated media that hold some complicity, some agency in the subject itself, that are somehow guilty, just like that military camera was, just like the pink film that I used in Congo. There's a kind of complicity. I call these aggravated media. And I realized that photography, is in a very essential part of the rainforest's disappearance. But also all the data that we're getting, and we hear about tipping points in the Amazon, and we only have 10 years left. And that's all that data that scientists are running through is all photographic, and it's coming from remote sensing satellites in space. And they've been gathering that for decades, since the 70s and 80s, I believe. So it's just a huge store of information that's all taken photographically using the exact same multispectral technology as these drones are. So here is a fascinating thing, is that the multispectral photography itself is at the crossroads of the subject. On one hand is complicit or guilty of the crime of environmental catastrophe. At the same time, it's also used by scientists to predict our tipping points and to understand and model how long we have left. And it's used by, it's going hopefully to save the forest as well. So that got me really interested in the medium of multispectral imaging. And I didn't know, but they use it they were using it right in that year. Bolsonaro opened up the indigenous ancestral territories for multinational mining companies to lay stakes to start mining rare earths. This is just mind-boggling. And the multinational mining companies, they all immediately plowed loads of money into mapping out these spaces using these cameras. So I then wanted to embrace this technology, which you probably never heard of, but is a huge industry. It's very important for understanding so much about the planet and the environment and GIS, Geographic Information Systems. I'm going to try to avoid bamboozling you with the jargon, and there's a lot of it with GIS, but I made this map using a drone and a 10-band multispectral camera, and this is the Pantanal, where it's the largest tropical wetlands in the world, and the most remarkable place. If you ever get the chance to go, please go. It's full of wild jaguars and the most extraordinary bird and aquatic life. But that year they burnt 25% of the entire Pantanal, which is a huge area. And it's also UNESCO World Heritage Site. Yeah, and that's because this wetlands dried out, and the fires which were lit by man mostly men, burnt through the root system, subterranean fires, and so were impossible to perceive. And I found that my camera could actually see them. So I started making those maps, many of which are here on the show tonight. But I also invited Ben and Trevor back to make this film, which we'll show after. And nobody's ever made a multispectral video camera, ever, and probably nobody ever will again. So this was my pandemic baby. I built this thing in collaboration with the company in Toronto. And it worked to our greatest amazement. And I strapped it to the bottom of the nose of a helicopter, and we flew it over the Amazon. And that's important because we really need to see the scale. And this is not carried out by one family or two families. This is systematic deforestation by organized mafia rings who are paid for by multinationals. And that includes companies like JBS, who are a huge company who are largely responsible for cattle and leather coming from Brazil, and a lot of it is culled directly from the forest. They have ways of pretending it's not. But you can't look at this image and say, oh, but sure, it's not organized. This is a serious organization going on here, and it's hard to achieve an image like that. And I'm really glad we figured it out with that particular camera. And this is in Roraima, which is a very northernmost remote state in Brazil, right on the Venezuelan border. This is the river Uraricoera. And this is where the famous Yanomami are from. And you may have heard of them. They're one of the larger tribes in Brazil who are still largely uncontacted or recently contacted. And they're a very interesting group who resist rather than collaborate with illegal gold miners. And I was looking, for a human element to try to give people something to relate to, because it's hard to relate to a beetle or a burnt tree. We need to have the human element, and I couldn't find those fault lines. I spent years looking for it, and then I heard about a confrontation that happened between illegal gold miners, garimpeiros, who'd gone up there's at least 20,000 of these guys who are invading Roraima, the Yanomami territory. It's totally illegal, but there's so much gold there, they don't care. They come armed, and some of them have links with the narco cartels, and they're dangerous. And there's a big money to be made, and they bring these huge amounts of diesel to run their generators, to run their gold pits, so they can extract gold. And it's highly, highly toxic. They use mercury. A lot of that mercury goes into the river systems. Those gold pits generate malaria from the mosquitoes. All kinds of diseases are spread, especially amongst the children of these communities, which we saw firsthand. But so they decided enough's enough, and we're going to blockade the river with ropes. And they did that. And the first boat up was carrying several tons of diesel for the generators. And the Yanomami seized the diesel and burnt it. And this is worth a huge fortune to gold miners in Brazil. So there naturally was a violent confrontation. Shots were fired. Some people were allegedly killed. And then the federal police fled. We're very remote here. We're 6 days by boat upriver from any road. There's no electricity. I had to fly in for 3 hours by light aircraft to get there. And it's really the Wild West. And so the surviving gold miners came back successfully every night for weeks to terrorize the community. Tear gas canisters, firing indiscriminately through the huts with machine guns. Yeah, so I heard about this and I said, well, this is the fault line. I mean, we won't find this again, actually, very easily. So I convinced their leader to let me go in. And luckily, they'd all had their vaccine because they're susceptible to respiratory viral diseases. Indigenous genetics are such that you really can't mess with that during the pandemic. But luckily, they'd all had their vaccine in this community. So we were able to go in and they organized themselves into groups. And one of the most powerful speakers was this young woman named Adnea, who's one of their leaders. And she spoke extremely eloquently and powerfully and emotionally. And you cannot not but understand what she's saying as a human. It took me many months to get her words translated, and I knew it was important. I had no idea what she was saying. And I love the fact she indicts me in everything she says. There's a real confrontation, a face-off. It's like, you can't just come in here and go home with your footage and not do anything. We're not painted up because they got all dressed up for us for nothing, you know. And it's a 7-minute sequence in the film, if you watch it, which we didn't cut whatsoever. And she repeats herself a bit, but it's kind of tour de force of rhetorical genius. Like, she's brilliant. And she never went to university like us. Mm-hmm. And she's straight from the heart, because she had to flee with her children, her toddlers, in the middle of the night, only a couple of days before, a machine gun strafing her hut, and she had to flee into the forest. So, you know, you can feel that unbridled emotion, and yeah, we just let her speak. And I think that all the legwork we put into the film was finally allowed us, once we'd found that material, allowed us to give her a platform and to take her words around as wide as we possibly could, including to Santa Fe. Mm-hmm. So I'll just stop there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It was really brilliant to hear all of that from you.
Thank you.
We're unfortunately coming up close to time, but that's okay.
Sorry.
We also had to just let you talk because that was way more important than any question I could have asked you. But so all of you know, we will be around during the openings. You'll be able to ask questions. This isn't the only moment. But I thought while we're all here with you, it would be great to kind of ground our audience who's just about to see the exhibition in just a couple more pointers in what they might be looking for when they see the show. I mean, one thing that I can say is one of my favorite things about this work, Broken Spectre, and all the other works in the show, is that what Richard alluded to was that, you know, we're really kind of seeing climate change happening in this work. You know, we all generally just feel the effects of it, but you don't actually get to see it. And so in these works, in this installation, you're really seeing mining, logging, burning. And one note that I was giving to somebody that was walking through the show with today is if you look at the wall labels, you can actually kind of see each one of those actions happening. And it's just kind of really incredible to be able to, that he allows us to kind of make this visible, this actual, like, seeing it happen rather than just feeling the effects of it. So that's sort of just one hint. But I was also wondering if you could maybe just say a few words about grid before people, so there's another video that's upstairs, two channels. Maybe you could just say a few words on that.
Yeah, so that's a half-an-hour piece. It's much smaller than this, and it's in the other side of the building, and it's all the people aside from Adnea who spoke, because they had a lot of contextual information, and so, you know, all the details about the situation that they faced, and they spoke very eloquently too. And I thought, well, we can't waste this, so I paired it up with the original elements captured by drone, which you'll see on the other facing screen, which in a way is the sort of industrial gaze of the multinational extractivist industries, you know. It's the way of looking at the rainforest as a commodity to be exploited. And on the other side, you have a very different type of imagery, sort of the human, you know, they're narratives which are very compelling and fascinating, and they make it's just important that this material is in the world somewhere. And sadly, this is only the second time I've been able to show it. It's a difficult work, and the first time was in the Hayward Gallery in London, and I'm so thrilled I can show it. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
We're very honored to be able to show it. One last question. I was asked this morning and I couldn't give the correct answer, so help me out here. The title, Broken Spectre. Can you just say a few words on how you came to that title?
Yeah, well, so I'm dipping into the scientific technologies. So I have the 3 ways of seeing in the film and throughout the show here. One is ultraviolet, looking at the forest floor, at the microbiome the non-human. And that's drawing from the language of scientists who use ultraviolet spectroscopy to learn and understand things about flowers and plant life. So as an artist, I'm working with that on an aesthetic level. And then the multispectral, the remote sensing from satellites, I'm borrowing that language. And sorry, what was the question? I went off in my thoughts.
The title, Broken Spectre.
Oh, yes.
How did you come to it?
So, and then the third one, just briefly, is this black and white infrared. And so each of those are actually discrete, separate spectral wavelengths. And so I'm ranging up and down, like I'm really grinding the gears of the electromagnetic spectrum, so to speak. And all of them are derived from scientific imaging techniques. And so I wanted to incorporate that into the title. It's a bit of a long-winded story, but the Brocken Spectre is an optical phenomenon that Goethe described first. There's a mountain called the Brocken, Mount Brocken, in the Harz Mountains in Germany. And I got very interested in that. And you've probably seen it if you're taking off in an airplane, you're breaking through clouds and the sun is above in the morning. You see a kind of halo, sort of rainbow halo around the airplane, written on the cloud. Anyway, it was a kind of generative idea for me right at the start of the piece to do with the sublime, the mathematical sublime. As I said, it's a long-winded one, but I like the title. Some people, get caught up on it. It shouldn't be a red herring,
right?
But it's definitely an unusual film, and there's of course the spectre of climate change. That's the obvious elephant in the room here.
Right. Well, I could go on asking you questions endlessly, and I'm sure their audience could too. But if you do hear that ding-dong in the background, that is people starting to come in for the opening. So we've got to fire up this video and start to change over the chairs. And we're here for the next 2 hours, so please do come up and ask any questions. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.